Yeah.
We're live.
Awesome.
Right.
So, I was gonna ask, do you guys care if we take a couple of minutes and just talk about the project a little bit? And Dr. Moore, I guess it's serendipitous that you're here because I might have a question for you, but
Yeah,
I
me
kind of
too.
wanted to just talk with the group about it for a minute.
Sure.
That's fine with
Does
me.
anybody care if we take a few minutes to do that?
No, that's fine.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I looked at Nasia's video yesterday, and my question about that was, I mean, it was obviously a good example, but she explained the techniques that she was using in the video. But my impression was that part, like the techniques in that, were supposed to be in the user guide that goes along with,
Yeah,
not in the.
you're exactly right. Although just a few minutes before we started, I finished updating the rubric a little bit to try to clarify that. So what I'm going to do is give you guys the choice. You can either include that as part of your video, for example, demonstrate a concept and then just go ahead and sort of explain what you did, or you can have a separate user guide or explanation paper that would simply say, okay, I first introduced principle one. It was the split attention principle, and this is how I demonstrated that. So you can either verbally do it or have an external document. Someone actually asked if they could have a separate video of explanation, and that's fine too. So really, I just want to have some way for you to communicate that, sort of explain how you used it in that particular demonstration. But how you do that really is up to you guys.
Okay. I
But
was gonna.
I have a question. But the explanation part do not count into the 15 minutes engagement, right?
It shouldn't.
It shouldn't.
Yeah. You don't want to spend 30 seconds demonstrating and then 15 minutes just talking about it, and you've only gotten to principle one. But so yeah, you'll have to sort of yeah. When I'm talking about the 15-minute time, I'm talking specifically about sort of the demonstration part.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Okay.
I'll actually post something about that to remind everybody else because that's actually a really good point
That is a good point.
to clarify.
I was actually gonna create something that I can really use in my classroom. So.
And if you do that, then you definitely don't want to have to stop in the middle and sort of explain
Right.
what you're doing. Yeah. But again, you could do that in another video if you wanted to, if it was easier just to sort of talk about it, or
Okay.
try to it's not going to take very long. Simply say that because we all know, for example, let's say you use the split attention principle. We all know what that is now. What I'm interested in, you're saying, okay, this is you're use that principle, and but then go into the specifics. Like Nasia said, use the planets or whatever. Talk about, okay, I put the words directly onto the planets because I was unifying that principle. So whatever context that you're talking about, to put it into that. So it doesn't really have to be particularly extensive, just enough to sort of demonstrate that you knew what the principle was and you knew how you used it, and that the user is clear about sort of how you pulled that together.
Okay.
Okay, and also the demonstration do not necessary to be like one subject content, right? For example, I select 5 principles to demonstrate a science lesson and use another 5 principle to demonstrate a language learning lesson. Does that work?
That's perfect. That's perfect. Yeah. I do want, though, like I said, the user test. I want somebody to go through it. And so what I would suggest, if you have the explanation right after the demonstration, just pause the video and then ask for some feedback.
Okay.
And then you can play it, and they can listen to it. It's not going to hurt anybody. And then just go on to the next one. So yeah, but you can the content. You can have different content for each of the 10 ones if you want.
Okay, perfect.
Obviously, if you have a actual learners or an actual classroom, it makes sense to sort of maybe unify into one or two lessons because then you can actually use it.
Okay. Oh, and one more is in the syllabus, there is assessment and data collection. I'm wondering what's that for?
There isn't any more.
Oh,
That's part of my revision of the syllabus. I changed that so it's just essentially the user test is the assessment.
okay.
So the feedback that you get from the user test, you have to add it to the video demonstration?
Final version, right.
Okay.
So for example, let's say something really just cosmetic. Somebody says, I couldn't read the text on your screen.
Okay.
Well, then you need to go back and revise that so that the text can be seen on the screen. Or there may be some comments that you don't think are good comments. I mean, you'll write them down. You say, okay, my user identified these things, but this is the reason why I'm not going to go and update that.
Okay.
I'm using my teacher's judgment, my designer's judgment to override what that user said, but I still want to see what the user said and what your response to that was in that case.
Okay.
So, okay, that leads me to another question. So, I'm planning on doing the video with the actual content and then doing the explanation in writing along with.
Sure.
So, after I do the user test, get that feedback, make changes or not or whatever, can I just add like a new section to the written portion to talk about the user feedback and how I adjusted or didn't adjust based on that?
Sure.
Does that need to be a separate document or
same document?
just be part of the whole written guide piece?
Yeah, it would just be part of the whole guide. Yeah, in fact, that actually would be convenient for for me to see it all in one place.
Okay, and then last question for me. Do we have to, I know we said that we could use perhaps one or two lessons and demonstrate different principles using those. My question is, if I have some content that I've already created, like in the course of my job and that, am I able to use that, or do I need to create something new specifically for the demonstration? Or can I use something that I already have?
It depends on what you mean by use it. I mean, if you're using that as like source material, then that's probably okay. But if you're just going to say, this is something I've already done and let me talk about it, I'd actually like you to redo it then in that case.
Yeah, actually, to be specific, what I'm thinking of is a training with a PowerPoint that I had done before, where I hadn't used any of these kinds of principles. So I was actually going to update it using the principles.
That's perfectly fine.
It's just not brand new content.
Yeah.
But I was going to update it.
No, I think that's fine. That's fine
Okay.
as long as you're bringing something new to the table. For example, and I do like original files, but for example, for the demonstration, Nasia used a picture of the planets. Well, she didn't create that picture. So I'm lenient with using outside resources, whether they're your own or someone else's, although I would much prefer to have original content.
Okay.
And I think if we had longer in the class, I would probably require to have it all original content, or at least content that you produce instead of borrowing from somewhere else.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Good questions.
All right, ladies. Tessa, you want to kick us off?
Sure. That's fine. So starting with chapter 17, the self-explanation principle, that really hit home with me because the kids always have to self-explain everything. And I think just as a teacher, it's really important that they can explain their thinking, because then I know where I can help them to make adjustments with their thought process or the way that they solved a problem or something. Um,
Yeah, especially
Okay,
in
cool.
math lessons, the word problems, I see the explain thing in elementary classes.
yeah.
So my daughter used to always come and ask me, what should I write? What should I write? And she used to write a story. So in first grade, second grade, even I didn't know what they were actually, because we didn't have any such kind of self-explanation in back in India. So I just asked her to write what you did. If it was multiplication, what you did, and then subtract what you did. But I thought after reading this chapter, I thought instead of just open-ended self-explanation, if it was a focused kind of self-explanation, it would have been much better.
Hmm.
Every time in word problems, we see just explain without any emphasis on what we should explain, right?
No, I agree completely, because the kids in my class are always asking, well, what do you want me to say?
Yes.
And then I end up giving them a more focused guide, but the textbooks just say explain.
Yeah.
It's really difficult for them.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially at that grade level, I would think.
Yeah.
I really liked the let me find what page it's on 420, the figure where it showed the continuum of self-explanation from wide open, like the open-ended, and then narrowing it down all the way to the menu-based. And the thing that I liked about that is that you can immediately think of, and especially based on the examples that you guys just talked about, you can immediately think of when each kind of um, specified or open feedback or self-explanation might be more beneficial,
Yeah.
right? Like if it's a philosophy course for college students, then maybe that open-ended is more effective, and you see where they take it or what have you. But if it's a novice person or a younger learner, or you're trying to be efficient and not cause extraneous load by them figuring out, okay, what am I supposed to say, then the focused or
The
the menu
scaffolding,
based.
yes. Yeah.
Yeah. um so I really liked that part of it.
Hmm.
Yeah, even I thought the same thing. For the novice, first start with the scaffolding, then the menu, or maybe the focused, and later on, maybe build up on that. Yeah,
Hmm.
even I thought the same thing.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but
actually, that brings up a question really quick before we leave scaffolding, because I understand scaffolding in terms of uh, creating the materials and the learning. You teach a concept and then you kind of build on that, and then you kind of build on that. But I'm not sure how it related to self-explanation. Do you guys get that part? I was a little fuzzy
No,
on that.
what I understood was it was just fill in the blanks, like they give half of the information and we, as a learner, has to fill the rest. That's what I understood from scaffolding. Yang, you were saying something.
and I think like especially for younger learners or like the learning use another language, scaffolding is really necessary because sometimes like for me I cannot find a exact word I want to say in English.
Yeah.
So
Hmm. Like
scaffolding
you
is
know
really
what it is,
helpful.
but I'll know it if I see it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I know exactly what she's telling because my brain always thinks in my native language, and when I speak, I am translating each word by word, and
Hmm.
sometimes I get stuck like this. What what's
Hmm.
the exact
Uh-huh.
translation? So
Hmm.
yes, I agree with you, Siang. Yes.
Mhm.
Okay. Yeah, I did see the fill in the blank part. I guess I guess just based on the way I had pictured scaffolding in terms of building content, it just didn't quite connect because I'm picturing literally a scaffold, so it didn't seem to match what they were trying to talk about. So I just wanted to make sure I was clear. Thank you.
Mhm.
You're welcome.
What else about this chapter stood out to
But
you?
one thing I am a little bit confused on is about what's the biggest like difference between the self-explanation and like teaching others. I feel like if I learn something, I think the best way to get a deeper understanding is like teach to someone else. So like, what's the difference between these two? I feel like they both like explain things again.
What I understood was, Yang, like self-explanation, you can do it independently, self-learning.
Hmm.
Like if you, when you read a paragraph, you can self-explain it to yourselves. It's like a self-assessment. You know what you have learned. You have like that. We were talking about that in the last class, because we won't know until we talk about that what we actually understood.
Hmm.
But here, explanation is kind of giving a prompt. It's kind of a generative learning. You make some connections from a learning material and explain what it is. So we have a better mental model. We really will understand whether we really learned or understood that material. That's what I understood. I don't know if I answered your question, but
No,
I
Kelly.
have a couple of thoughts. Go ahead, Jessa.
I agree with you because it talks about whenever you self-explain, you can identify and fill in your own gaps of what you don't know. So, kind of like, I don't know if you guys remember, I was talking in class about the number talks we do for math, where
Yes.
they they all give me answers and I put them all on the board, and then I ask them to tell me how they got their answer. And sometimes that leads to them figuring out where their gap was or what they did wrong and why they got the wrong answer. So
Yes.
they explain themselves and then they fill in those gaps for themselves because they are able to figure out, oh, that's where I messed up. This
Hmm.
makes sense now.
Yeah, that makes sense. Hmm.
hmm I was going to add a couple of things. One of the things that I was thinking of saying when you were asking the question, and then Soraya when you were answering, um, the self-explanation kind of reminds me of, for instance, like on our midterm exam when we had the questions and then we had the kind of short answer paragraph
Yeah.
where we have to explain what we know about this principle or that principle. So we're explaining it for the purpose of showing that we know it, um, versus it being like a teaching situation where others are involved. So I kind of view it as a form of assessment, whether it's going to the teacher or professor, or whether it's just
Mm.
you, you know, reinforcing it with yourself. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yes. Even I
Yeah.
thought
And then,
first when we did the Google Hangout thing, I thought Dr. Moore was implementing the collaborating principle. I thought like that, working in teams. But while reading this chapter, I was thinking it's kind of a self-explanation principle that's going on. I'm not sure whether it's open-ended or focused, because it could be focused because we could talk only about these two chapters, right? So it could be focused, while focus self-explanation prompt, or it could, and the midterm, as you said, Kelly, it could be more of again focused, uh, interactive kind of. Remember the framework ICAP,
Hmm.
mhm.
focused, interactive kind of self-explanation. So we are critiquing each other's answers and generating our own learning. Even I thought the same thing, Kelly. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because, I mean, in this activity, we're kind of self-explaining this is what I took from the material. but then we're also sort of clarifying and asking each other questions, how did you understand this, etc. So it's kind of a combination. But one other piece that I thought of too, and this is probably more of like a corporate or a employment related type example, but when managers are training someone to do a job, always encourage them to check for understanding. You can explain to someone how to process a bank transaction, and then you can ask, do you understand? And the person can say, oh, yeah, I understand. And you don't really know if they do or not, right? So if you ask them, okay, repeat it back to me, that's a form of focused self-explanation. And if they can put it into words, then it's more likely that they actually get it.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Okay. Cool. What else?
Yeah, just like Jessa said, it is making inferences, then mapping the inferences with the existing mental models, then identifying and filling the gaps by cognitively engaging, right? Even if the expert is not present to teach. Then there are some boundary conditions or limitations that was discussed. Do you want to talk about that before going forward? Like it does not, yeah, it does not work if when you are dealing with grammar rules, procedure grammar rules. So if there is
Because there's a lot of
remember that
exceptions.
example.
Mm-hmm.
And also the other one, when learning artificial categories with exceptions. Do you remember that?
Mm-hmm.
When one example where they're asking people who rarely or frequently donate to charities, when you're comparing between such artificial categories, it doesn't be effective or something like that. Remember?
I'm
Remember that?
trying to think of what you're.
I have on page 417. It talks a little bit about how unreliable
Yeah, yes.
categories,
Reliable and
prompting
unreliable
learners to
categories.
self-explain, hinder their learning, and I think that probably comes along with like.
Yeah, I feel like if what we learn is some like the fact, something we just need to remember it, is really the self-explanation really do not help, because you just do not have things to explain about it, just remember it. Like the grammar stuff, I
Or
think
maybe there are any
learn
logical
one
connection.
just to remember it.
Okay.
Yeah, I can definitely see how that would relate to language learning, because I'm on that page now, and the unreliable um, is I guess that's what they call it when there are multiple examples or multiple exceptions
Okay.
to a general rule. Um, so, like in English, on 416, it talks about, I think it's the next to last paragraph, it talks about learning whether to say a dog versus the dog or this dog, and everybody knows that the English language is crazy, so that wouldn't be a reliable uh, format or domain in which to expect a student to self-explain because there are so many different variables. And I got the impression, and I think it mentioned a few things like biology and physics and things that are more conceptual. Um, and earlier I thought of philosophy as well. Um, but obviously, from what Jess is saying, then math would be an applicable domain as well.
Yeah, I think there's a big list on page 415 of the different. I don't know. I wrote in my margin because fractions is a fifth grade
Oh, yeah.
standard, and
Right.
that's something that we spend a lot of time on, and they need to
I
do.
still don't get fractions, by the way. I still don't. I'm 45. I don't get fractions. I'm horrible at them. Just so you know. But yeah, you're right, Jessa. Fractions, probability,
Number
equation.
conservation. Tons of that stuff is based in math.
Yeah,
Hmm.
in fractions you also use the drawing principle, right? The generate drawing, the I'm talking everything related to what my kids learn.
Yep.
You're going to be much better at helping your kids with their homework now, right?
Yes,
You learn all
yes,
these
I can
principles.
explain why she's doing that when she's cutting the pizza into many sections. Now I understand.
Funny.
Yeah.
Oh,
There
actually,
was one
Priscilla,
other part. Oh,
just I
sorry.
have a question
Go
for you.
ahead, Saying.
I'm just wondering, like, when your students like taking a math test, do you allow them to like do some self-explanation during the test taking? Because I
Yeah.
remember, like, when I was in elementary school, one of my classmates just like when she taking exams, she really like mumbling by herself. I feel like that's kind of self-explanation, but when taking tests, we are required to like just keep quiet for all the time. So it's really do not help that students process her thinking. So sometimes he will like take to another classroom to do the
Mhm.
test. So is there like any example in your school?
Yeah, we actually have we do inclusion with our intervention specialist, but she will pull certain groups of kids out that need those special accommodations. And something that's really interesting is it's called a whisper phone, and it's an accommodation that we have, and it's a headset that you put on, and it has a piece that comes to your mouth, and you can whisper into it, and it relays it back to your ears so that not everybody around you is being disrupted by whatever you're saying,
Oh,
and but you still hear what you're thinking. And I actually encourage that with my kids to go ahead and self-explain to yourself, like, what, go through the steps, say them out loud if you need to. What did we learn? How did we do this? And I think that it really helps some,
mhm.
whereas others, they like to, because if they can explain their thought process in solving a problem and show their work to me, I
Mhm.
can give them partial credit. And I always tell them it helps me to figure out what I need to do, teach better, you know? And
Yeah. Mhm.
I think that it's really important. So
So
yeah,
that's a,
we do have things like take them out of the classroom,
mm,
or we have a couple whisper phones that some of the kids use if they don't have the special accommodations where they
mm,
can leave.
mm. Thank you.
So if
That's really
somebody
nice.
has
Thank
like
Did
you.
that answer your question?
Yeah. Yeah.
like if someone needs to verbally uh, talk through the information to process it, then that allows them a different way
Yeah.
versus like someone else might draw a picture or I would probably write it down or something like that. That's
Yeah.
really cool.
Yeah, it's really cool.
That's really cool.
Mhm.
So one of the things I just was looking back at that I underlined and put big stars by on 416, it was talking about the study. Let me find the topic. It starts where it says using 2x2 design.
Uh-huh.
They compared self-explanation with no self-explanation crossed with the presence or absence of instructional explanations. Um, and it talked about the students being able to type an explanation. They could click a button to receive an explanation, which I guess is like directions on what their explanation should be. Um, and it talked about the fact that the students who were prompted to self-explain but did not receive explanations performed the best. Um, so it sounds like, if I'm understanding, the word explanation I think is tripping me up a bit. It sounds like what they're saying is the students who came up with their own explanations versus being given and explanation performed better, which
Yeah.
seems to be consistent with some of the other study results. Is that what
Yes.
you guys interpret?
Yeah. When they
Okay.
were giving the self-explanation prompt and no instructional explanation, that was the best. And
Mm-hmm.
also, by giving instructional explanation, it was an okay performance, but the other one led to better performance. Yes, more superior.
Mm-hmm.
I was kind of surprised by that, honestly, because sometimes I guess it would be just situational. What if the child or the learner didn't had their explanation was wrong, and
Right.
wouldn't it
Hmm.
be helpful to have the direct instruction there?
But you know what I feel? I feel is mm, the instruction explanation and the feedback, like they have some like they have really similar, but they're still different. So like this is what I think maybe at that time under that situation when the student's self-explanation is like it's wrong. So that's the time we're going to provide a feedback,
Yes.
Okay.
but not other like instructional explanations. But it's really like difficult to like adjust the difference between these two.
Hmm.
I
Even
agree. Like,
yeah, yeah.
remember they were talking, I think it was in 18 maybe, where they were talking about how some of the principles are interrelated and some can be independent. And I think depending on what kind of self-explanation you're asking of the students, I almost feel like you have to have the feedback along with that.
Yeah.
Because again, if there's self-explanation, the more open it is, the more chance they might have to get it wrong. And the feedback is the thing that helps them correct the mental model. So I almost feel like you have to have both of those together.
Mm-hmm.
I
I
guess it
agree.
depends on the domain, but they seem kind of interdependent. Well, or
Mm-hmm.
at least the self-explanation would be dependent on feedback.
No, I agree completely. Like, because we were talking about word problems earlier, so it's great if a child can explain themselves and fill in their own gaps. But if they can't, that's where the feedback would have to come in
Yeah.
for them to really benefit from their self-explanation if they were not able to fill in the gaps.
Yes. And also,
Yeah.
I also felt that adding that explanation, it was too much processing going on, right? It
Yeah.
was too much load going on. So it's better to take one out and give the feedback if necessary.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So let me ask you this, Justin, saying, because I know I don't have really any teaching experience in Surrey. I don't think you do either, or at least I haven't heard you talk about it. But can you think of, like Jesse, you mentioned a little bit about focused self-explanation with the math problems and that, but what about the resource-based or the menu-based? Have either of you guys used those at some point?
Menu based, we use it in multiple choice questions, right? Menu based
Mm-hmm.
self
Yeah.
explanation.
Yeah.
That's the thing. When
It's more.
just recognition of the answers from 3 or 4 choices, right? And resource based, it just the same, but I felt that we'll be asked a question, but the resource would be the chapter. We'll be given a bigger glossary. We should find it more. We should dig into it to find the answer,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's what I
Mm-hmm.
thought. What do
Yeah,
you?
but based on my teaching experience, like because the most teaching in my middle school was just the teacher lecturing the students, but not on computers. So I really do not have examples about menu-based.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess that would probably pretty much be a digital function.
Um, sometimes, a lot of times in science, I will have them look up the answer in their book and then record the page number that they found their answer on so that they can say that, I use this resource to find my answer, and that helps them explain themselves. So
That's a good idea.
I think that falls in there.
Another example were language lessons. In order to also learn how to use the dictionary, they'll be asked to find the exact meaning from the dictionary. My kid does that sometimes. They'll be just to know, instead of looking into the phone, she kind of likes to look at the phone what the meaning is, but the teacher has to look at the dictionary. It's also a resource based, right?
That reminds me of the two guys in our class who are librarians and perhaps learning the library or the research skills. So I wonder if that's her teacher trying to get the students to not totally just rely on their phone and, know a little bit more about traditional research.
And I feel like the menu-based and resource-based is really more suitable for the computer-based learning because, like, if in a computer, if you prompt me a open-ended self-explanation, I feel like, oh, I'm going to like do another essay questions. I really do not like typing a lot of extra words there. I feel less like extraneous cognitive load for me, but just a click and choose from the menu, I think that's really better for me.
Yeah, agreed. Well, and if you're doing a computer-based, then having a paragraph, unless you go in and do it manually, would be much harder to evaluate.
Yeah.
You might have to depend on like a system looking for keywords in their answer or something like that. So in terms of assessment of the answers, that could be a big challenge.
No, I agree. It's kind of a bittersweet thing because I personally would rather be able to explain myself and everything that I'm saying. But as a teacher, to get that back and have to grade essay after essay after essay, it's kind of terrible and very time consuming.
Yeah. I
So
can understand that. Yeah, totally. What else? Oh, I found a typo. Did you guys
so
find
did I.
a typo?
It should
Which
say
one did you find, Jessa?
I
On
forget what it was.
425?
It should say of, shouldn't it?
Yep.
Where is it?
It's in the middle of 425.
A great deal of information.
Yeah. I was feeling a little Irish when I was reading that.
Oh, yeah.
Great deal of information.
I did notice that.
I thought that was funny. I heard somebody talking about a typo in another chapter. I don't know if I caught it or not, but as soon as I saw that, I was like, "Ooh, I gotta mark that down." I was proud of myself.
I noticed that too. I just fixed it. I put an F there.
Well, whoever reads your book and sell it, they'll be grateful for it. Oh, man. Oh, one of the things that I thought was kind of weird, on 426 at the top, was talking about the resource-based self-explanation and the geometry rules, and it said that there was no gains in learning with identifying parts of the diagram in addition to selecting the geometry rule to explain or justify their answer. That seemed really odd to me.
I agree. I put a question mark there, like, that doesn't really make sense.
I mean, I guess it could be considered redundant, but being visual, I would want to mark up the diagram too.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting.
Yes, when they used resource based for both the condition, right? I can remember. Both the studies use the same resource based or something like that.
Yeah, it was comparing two resource-based.
Okay. And there was no additional benefits. It says no additional benefits. Okay.
So that's got to be redundancy, don't you think? Because they use the resource to select the rule of geometry that applied to the answer, but then there wasn't any additional benefit to referencing the diagram also.
Okay.
Well, you mentioned ICAP, Soraya, earlier, which that's the first time I'd heard that acronym, and I wrote that down in big letters with stars and underline and everything. I think that's a really good thing for us to remember when we're putting material together and creating instruction, to use that in terms of, if interactive is the best, we try for that. If for some reason that's not feasible, then we go to constructive, and so on. So that part I thought was really cool.
It should just not be engaging. It should be cognitively engaging, so that there is some benefits. So it says that there they say that for active they use usually menu based and resource based or scaffolded. For constructive they use the open ended or focused, and for the interactive, like working in pairs or groups. So what would be the limitations? We talked about the boundary condition. What would be the limitation of the current research and future research? It talks about some adaptive self-explanation tutors. Remember? Implications for future research?
Yeah, I was talking about more research needs to be done to see if the self-explanation in particular has some greater benefit than any other kind of strategy that requires engagement, such as teaching to others or writing a summary, which to me is kind of the same thing as a self-explanation. I guess maybe the difference is the audience if the summary is for someone else, like Tang mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
I don't know. But I kind of get the impression that the whole point of it is that if you spend more time critically thinking about the material, even if the format is slightly different, that's what gets it to sink in. I remember last weekend we were talking about the fact that we had a much better grasp on all this material that we're learning in this class because we've had these discussions. So again, it kind of circles back to what somebody said earlier, that this exercise of having the group discussion is kind of a form of self-explanation as well. You guys agree?
Actually, I thought, have you done the GRE exam?
No.
No. Usually, you might have heard that in GRE exam, the next question comes. It is personalized. If we answer a tough question, the coming question will be more tougher. Or if we going wrong, it is personalized in some way.
So I didn't know that.
Or if you like have many wrong answers previously.
Yes. Some personalization is going on. In similar way, here it's the adaptive self-explanation means based on the answers that the learner is giving, uh, it should be adapted in such a way that if the learner doesn't need much explanation, you don't have to give it. It talks about some knowledge component. If the knowledge component is very low, you have to give the self-explanation, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I do remember seeing that with the higher knowledge folks that it could become extraneous versus beneficial.
Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned that because I didn't take the GRE, so I didn't know that it was like that. But the program that we use at our school to get our data from, it's called iReady, and the students start out with a diagnostic test, and then their score determines what level of lessons they start at.
Okay.
And then they take it once every 9 weeks. So the second 9 weeks they'll take it again, and it tests like the different domains, and then that it continues as they do it every day, depending on how they do on their lessons. That's the level that they're put at. And so as an educator, that's really important to me because I am evaluated on the amount of growth that they make from their first test at the beginning of the school year to the test that they take at the end. So I use that data all the time to figure out where my instruction needs to go for those kids performing at different levels.
Yeah.
So that they can make a year's worth of growth.
Yeah, even I think that's a very good thing, the future research, because always the focus is on the low knowledge learners, and there is very little focus on the high knowledge learners. I've heard that some kids for the first 6 months they don't learn anything in the school if they are like gifted students. So yeah, so if there is research and if we can adapt the self-explanation based on that, then I think it would be a huge thing, right?
Yeah, I think as far as technology goes that will work, but if it's just in the classroom, that's kind of up to the teacher to determine what they're doing. But I know I use the technology for that a lot because not only with iReady but with Study Island, I tell them, okay, I want you to start here and work through. And then once they get to a certain point, I have 5th graders, so once they get to a certain point, I bump them up to the 6th grade lessons and let them start working on those because there's no point in having them sit there and look at this 5th grade material that they already understand, so they can just move on and do 6th grade.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's really important for those high level learners because they get bored and it really hinders their learning.
And they start to act up in class and all that. Well,
Sometimes.
you know, and thinking about the corporate realm, which I always do, clearly, you know, the learning management systems, the LMS systems that many companies use, and I don't have a lot of access to the one my company uses just based on my job position, but from what I've seen, you know, the tracking and the progress reports and all of the data that can come from having all of those assessments and all of that information in one place. Well, an example would be new hire banker. So if we hire someone and they're going through banker training, most of it is web-based training, you know, interactive, and then they do conference calls, I think 3 times a week where it's interactive. There's an instructor. It's kind of like this format except not video. And there's discussion and then there's assessments and things. And so a few times, you know, there's been someone who hasn't been able to keep up with the training or they're not scoring well on the assessments and things like that. So the trainer will contact the manager and then they'll kind of talk and try to figure out where the issue is and what we need to do to try to help the employee with grasping the material and stuff. So I think that kind of data collection and the stuff, Jessica, that you were talking about, that's totally going to be the future. And I think it'll be more helpful than just a subjective, you know, I think they're getting it or they're not. So that's a good thing.
But Kelly, I have a question. So if like a newcomer banker get trained and he or she may not got perform well or got high score, will you're going to provide extra instructions, or I think that person will just be fired? Because I think in education and in industrial it's really different. Because in education we really try to help our students, but for industrial, what we do is just to seek the right person for this job.
Right, right. Well, part of the problem is that people oversell themselves in interviews. So, you know, we may have the impression that they have a level of knowledge that's a little more than they actually have. So, you know, we do have the qualifications and that they have to meet before they're selected for the job. And typically, if someone is struggling, we will go back and do a certain degree of remedial training with them. But after we go through it the second time, then that's usually the point at which we kind of say, yeah, this might not be the right position for you. And, you know, depending on a million factors, and we'll place them in a different job, or we may just sit down with them and say, this is not working out, you know, and end up doing a termination. But we do at least do one course of remedial before we would go to any kind of disciplinary. That's a good question.
Thank you.
Sure. All right. Are we ready to move on to 19?
Yeah, before that, at one point it also says that adding signaling cues to self-explanation. Remember, there are things here in this chapter that signaling cues added to self-explanation prompts gives much greater learning. So there's an integration of two principles here. Remember that, yeah. Okay,
Yeah,
next
point.
chapter. The feedback principle, I really like this chapter. I like both of them. Feedback principle I really like because I believe that if I get feedbacks from the instructor or anybody, I tend to perform much better than without any being blank, whether knowing what I'm doing is right or not. Because in India it's like that. All our instruction, just it's outcome feedback and nothing else. Because they don't have time to give feedback to each and every. There will be 60, 70 kids in every classes, you know. So it's just, but after coming here, every professor gives a feedback in one way or the other, and it has really helped me in several ways. You know, it's a graph. I can see myself climbing up if I get feedback.
Yeah, I agree. I like that too. Just, you know, for somebody to just confirm like, hey, you're on the right track, or no, you need to go back and look at whatever. Just that reassurance, you know.
Yeah. And it states that it is better for the novices giving the explanatory feedback. But again, I think we can give constructive feedback to high-level learners too, right?
Yeah, you know what? It really reminds me of my high school, middle school experience, because in China, if at least in my school, if we finish a test today, and probably the next week the teacher will just go through the whole test again to talk about all the questions. But it also I also think that maybe a kind of waste of time for like more gifted students because they just if they get every question correct, they just spend their time sitting there, learn nothing, but really good for novice learners like me.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you've talked before about having all different kinds of levels of kids in your class. How do you deal with that? Like,
Um, Something that I do before we take a test, we do a study guide. So I'll give them the study guide, and then um, I give them some. I don't know. I do it different all the time, but sometimes I'll give them the answers, and they'll grade it, and then certain groups that missed certain amounts will come back and we'll go through, and usually the ones that miss the most are at the level that need me to sit down with them and explain step by step every single question. So like if you only missed one on your study guide, I'm not going to make you sit through explanations of every single question that we did have. So it depends. I'll pull the group that needs that explanation and give them the explanation. Then the other ones, sometimes they can take their test a day early or something like that, and then while the rest of the kids are taking their test that I had to explain things to, then they can work on maybe an enrichment activity or something like that.
okay.
It's really nice.
Then it says about some other terminologies used for the feedback principle, like corrective feedback is also called as verification, elaborative also explanatory.
Yeah, and when I read this chapter, I really feel like the timing of provided feedback is really, really important because sometimes if you provide me the feedback immediately after I make a mistake, I think that may not really help me to think again about where I did wrong because sometimes maybe you just need a double check or need extra 5 minutes to think about it. I may do correct again. So I think the timing is really, really important, but it's also like based on different situations.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because I do remember reading a section about uh, it could become like an interruption to give immediate feedback. Like if someone is doing steps of a process and you stop and correct them, it could be viewed as perhaps even an extraneous load, but definitely an interruption of their attention.
Yeah.
But then, so I can see how it would be negative in some ways, but then also if you have them go through the entire process and they're off track, then they've kind of wasted time going in the wrong direction too. So I guess it would really be, I'm not sure what conditions would make one or the other more preferable. What do you guys think about that?
I think it depends upon like in a math, if the kids are doing addition and if it's getting wrong, and if a teacher notes that she can give it immediate feedback, right? Rather than the kid doing the whole problem and waiting till the end. But in some cases, like I remember they were mentioning about some flow chart or something. So it's better to wait until it's finished and then give the feedback so that they learn the step and not just copy what the feedback is, right? It could be
I
based
wonder
on.
if the difference maybe is whether or not, if it's a multi-step process, if the step that the person got wrong is going to prevent them from completing the rest of it correctly, then I guess you would have to stop and correct at that point.
Yes.
But for instance, and again, I'm picturing employee training, let's say that I'm being observed doing a simulation of sitting down with a customer to have a sales conversation. And so after I finish, Saray is my customer, we're doing a role play, and after I do my sales pitch, then Siang is my instructor, and she gives me feedback on what went well in the conversation, what might I do better in the next conversation. So at that point, it would be more beneficial to do the feedback at the end. So maybe that's the decision point.
Yeah, that's a good example, yes.
If you could go forward and complete the task with the mistake still intact, or if you have to stop them to keep from going left field.
Yeah.
What do you think, Jessa?
No, I agree completely with you. Whenever you said that, it made me think of I have to be observed so many times a year by my principal, and she's not going to stop me in the middle of my lesson and say, hey, hold on, I think you should do this differently.
Thank goodness.
That would be terrible. But it's very useful to get that feedback at the end so that I can change it for my next lesson or the next time that I'm going to be evaluated or how I'm going to do things differently. Whereas if a child is doing a math problem and they mess up the first step, I can say, hey, hold on, instead of having them complete, a 5-step problem after they mess up the first one. They're not learning. It's not helping them learn if they're doing it wrong. Practicing the wrong thing is not useful.
Yeah, I think correcting initially would help, right?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, and I also feel like for kids, for the younger learners, the positive feedback is really, really important for them. Like you put a sticker on their homework,
Yes.
they really like it. Oh, I got a little flower.
As they grow up, the stickers don't work, right? Yeah. In page 452, the core evidence for feedback principle in multimedia learning. In the second paragraph, they mention about using pedagogical agents in discovery-based learning, very beneficial. I was confused. I was thinking because it was a questionable thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they were saying that using the pedagogical agents and giving in discovery-based multimedia learning, it was very beneficial.
I know what you're talking about, and I noticed that too. And I think that they were talking about the presence of the agent in general, not providing a benefit, but if we're giving feedback to the learner anyway, and it comes from the agent, then maybe the learner feels like it's more interactive. So I almost feel like maybe that's different than the other principle from before, because the agent's purpose specifically is to give the feedback.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's kind of what I thought. What do you think?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yes. In the other case, it was just the agent without. It was extraneous, right? It was not doing anything. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
The thing that I discovered on that, well, I just used the word, the thing that caught my attention on that page was the discovery-based learning. Because I think I told you guys at the beginning that I really honed in on kind of the constructivist theory, and I think I'm kind of modifying that now as I'm learning more about it to more of the discovery-based learning or the inquiry-based learning. Because constructivism seems to be the extreme where you're asking the person to teach themselves from nothing, which is usually not going to be feasible. But the discovery-based learning having more guidance to it is going to still allow the person to self-discover and answer their own questions and kind of get there without it being spoon-fed, but yet it's guided to the point where it doesn't create that extraneous load. And the feedback portion of that, I think, is really important. Like, they were talking about the Design a Plant game. Do you guys remember that?
Mm-hmm.
They were designing characteristics for a plant based on the environment
Yes.
where the plant was going to be.
Yeah.
And the explanatory feedback group had higher test scores on transfer, and they also perceived the activity as more beneficial. So I thought that was a cool example.
Yeah.
Design a plant.
Mm-hmm.
We actually did something like that in my class because we talk about adaptations whenever we study ecosystems. So I had them make up their own animal or creature, and that their creature had to have certain adaptations based on where it was going to live. So they had to explain, like, my creature is really furry because it's cold where they live. You know what I mean? So I think that reminded me of that when I read it.
That is very cool. I bet you there's not too many adults that could come up with a completely non-existent animal the way a
They
kid
thought
would,
it
right?
was
'Cause
the
their
best thing in the
imagination is
world
so
to create
wider
this
than-
fictional creature.
Yeah, that would be. That's very cool.
So do you want to talk about the boundary conditions of the feedback principle? Again, first of all, it says that only the explanatory feedback is effective. The corrective feedback has very less impact on achievement. Then second, like while designing the feedback messages, we should consider the learner's cognitive process, the active processing. Then it here also it speaks about considering the modality principle. Remember, consider other design principles, the modality principle. Then finally, the learner characteristics. I was thinking how the learner characteristics is so important whenever we design any instruction.
Yeah, and feel like it really requires the teacher or the instruction designers have a rich experience on that. Because, like, when I look at when I did my student teaching, when I look at my host teacher when she teaching, I thought when she just to look at students' eyes, she know where are their minds at. Like, she can give immediate feedback. Or like some more explanations, that because he have been taught for 40 years, so it really requires experience.
You could see that confused expression, like, huh?
Yeah, just to look at students' eyes, I can see your mind.
I think you're right, because as you teach and you learn the content that you're supposed to teach, which is something that I'm still working on. I'm going into my third year of teaching, so even this past year, after my first year, I learned more about what I was teaching, and I picked up more of the common misconceptions that the kids would have about certain topics. So I would be prepared with that feedback already, expecting them to possibly have that kind of misconception.
And it's here that they talk about the immediate feedback and the delayed feedback. In the immediate feedback, learners tend to use the trial and error method. You know, which could be a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then what are the implications? I think we have covered a lot.
I want to just read my note here. On the middle of 456, I put a star by something here. Let me just see what it is. Or frame configure. I don't understand my own note that I wrote in the margin of the, of the book. That's not good. It was the next to last paragraph, right above the bold where it says consider other design principles.
Mhm.
And it was talking about, oh, I know. Okay, I got it now. There was the 4 frames or images of the process of lightning formation, and they were doing it on the computer, I believe, and they were testing, I think, the immediate versus the kind of end result feedback in terms of the person putting the images in the right order, right? And then, so they had one condition where it would give them feedback on the placement of each frame, whether it was correct, or it would give them a chance to place all 4 in the right order and then give the feedback. And the reason why I pointed this out and put stars by it is because it says the results show that those who received feedback on the whole sequence performed best on the transfer test. The authors concluded that feedback should support intentional and effortful processing of information in order to have an impact on student understanding. So I thought that was kind of interesting because that was a kind of a strong example of waiting until the task is complete to give the feedback.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing that if the feedback is given at the end of the task, then the student is maybe thinking of the feedback as a whole versus just one image versus the other, or after the other, and so it might not help them create as cohesive a mental picture.
Yeah.
I think you're right there because a lot of times, like if you the 4 different frames, they'd stick one up there, and if it didn't work, they just try another one, and I don't think they would pay nearly as much attention as to the actual order that it went in compared to if it stuck or not.
Right. And they would have like the total picture, and then they would see it was correct and maybe kind of looked back at all of the steps together.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah. It's necessary to give some information processing time, right, to the kids, than giving it immediately.
Yeah.
In such cases, delaying it really works. It's just to process the information in your mind.
As a whole concept or
Yeah.
versus
Yeah.
steps. Yeah. Cool. What else, guys?
I think then it talks about the cognitive theory, multimedia learning, how it is consistent with the theory, how the feedback principle is consistent with the cognitive theory of multimedia learning and its implications.
I thought it was interesting on the top of 457 how they were talking about sometimes spoken feedback on a post-test will allow students to process the feedback better because of the dual channel processing. So if they're looking at whatever it is and then they're hearing the feedback, then they're using that dual channel. I thought that was kind of cool. I would have never thought of that.
This chapter really explained really well the theoretical rationale of feedback principle. Remember, I can't find it out where it is. The theoretical rationale of the rationale they explained it really well, the cognitive theory of multimedia learning.
Yeah, I underlined that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
I
like
really
On page
that.
um,
451,
Yeah.
and it's in the top. I thought that that was a really great explanation too, and we had talked about that on Friday actually, whenever we were in
yeah.
Yes.
our group.
Yeah, that whole section it kind of provided a little recap
Mm-hmm.
Yes, yes.
of the cognitive theory from multimedia learning, and
Yes.
then it went directly into how the feedback applies to it. So
Yeah, that whole paragraph. It was so good.
Yeah.
I thought specifically, I think that'd be like the second sentence on that page where it starts out extraneous is essential, and yeah, that sentence. I thought that that really summed it up very well.
Yeah.
mhm, it did.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if they put that kind of recap in there to reduce our extraneous load by not making us remember all of that stuff and then go, oh yeah, that's how it applies to feedback principle.
But I find it as a revision thing, Kelly.
Mm-hmm.
Revision is important, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and for me, go back to talk about when to provide the feedback on page 460. It says some people like argue that immediate feedback may cause the learner to rely on that information as a crutch to have difficulty to performing when feedback is taken away. So like that reminds me of like a chemistry learning program I used when I was a college freshman. I remember like I think it's called Pearson Education. I remember when I like go to answer a chemistry questions, there's a hint button I can click if I do not know how to solve the problem, and then it will prompt some kind of step by step scaffolding solutions. Like the first step, you're going to calculate these, and second step, you're going to calculate that. And for me, sometimes I really don't know how to do that, so I will always use the hint because I can still earn partial credit on that.
Mhm.
So I don't know if that's really helped me learn or it encouraged me to being lazy because I use the hint a lot.
You know what I think? I think that the hint function is a really good idea because instead of you stopping in your tracks and becoming totally stumped and frustrated, um, you know, I mean, all of us have said in these discussions, like, oh, I can't remember where I saw that, but I remember such and such.
Mhm.
You know, like you remember an idea or a phrase or something, but you just can't bring the whole thing up. But then if you get the hint, you're like, oh yeah, that's what it was, you know. But
Yeah.
then I would think if you did the fading effect principle with the hints, like
Mhm.
as the person increases in their knowledge or as they improve their scores, then they get less and less hints. So I would think that would be an effective way to use it and have it be helpful, but not let it be a crutch.
Yeah, can be a good solution.
That's a great idea, Kelly, because if you are hovering around a question for a while, the hint can pop up, right? Otherwise, it could be faded.
Yeah, like you have 2 minutes, and then if you still can't figure it out, then you can click the hint.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Saying you're not lazy at all. You have 2 kids and you have like 2 degrees already, and you're getting another one. You're not lazy. Trust me.
Then again, it about the current implications for future research. it again mentions that we should know who the learners are, who are we training. Then the specific feedback messages, what should be or when to give it, what should be given, and how to adapt it to the learners. This gives us lots of ideas to do research on, right?
Yeah.
Right?
So, Sarah, are you a PhD student?
No, not at all, but in future, maybe.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
But you like research?
I do like research, but we need time, right, for everything with the family, kids.
Mm-hmm.
So it's there in my mind in future, but
So many ideas and so little time, right?
yeah.
Okay. Anything else that you guys can think of? I think we covered it pretty thoroughly.
Yeah. Another thing about the self-explanation, kind of linking to the drawing principle, I felt that both are generative learning strategies.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of, find similarities and dissimilarities. So both generative, reflective learning activities.
Yeah, those would be two more that could be integrated, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Or inter-reliant.
Yeah, and I also think like maybe especially for someone learn a second language, like instead of self-explanation verbally, it's really good just to draw pictures, I think.
Yeah.
I think especially with math, I don't know. It surprises me how much I use these principles in my instruction that I didn't know before. Like for
You know what they were called.
for fractions, I tell them to draw it, and I didn't realize that was a specific principle that I was using. But it's a lot easier for them to understand a lot of things in math if they can draw a picture of it. And yeah, I don't know. I just didn't realize that it was easy.
Actually, you know what
Even
that
I
reminds
think
me
that
of?
many of the instructions have been designed by using many of these principles, right? Many of the instructions already have been designed because there is research back of it.
Yeah, so people who've already studied all this, they've
They
incorporated
are the one
it.
who is the
We're
instruction
just figuring it out.
Cool.
I just want to mention real quick how I'm impressed with this team. You guys are so well prepared and have really delved deep into the material. And the way you guys cooperate going through this discussion is really impressive. It's really nice to sit back and just sort of watch you guys talk. Bite my tongue occasionally, but really strong team.
Thank you.
You're doing a great job.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're lucky. We got girl power.
Uh-huh.
Mhm.
Positive feedback.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the feedback. All right, guys.
Okay.
Thank you for the
Thanks.
time.
Bye bye. Thanks,
Sure,
Jessica.
guys.
All right. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.